Hey, today we're going to make a famous cake from all over Portugal called Bolo. This is a translation to king's cake, and it is seen throughout Portugal. This cake is now famous mainly throughout the Christmas season, from Christmas all the way to the Epiphany, when the three kings were said to visit baby Jesus on January 6th. This cake has a history that dates back many centuries. It's thought to have originated from a Roman festival called Saturnalia. This festival in Roman times celebrated the god of Saturn, and thus it was called Saturnalia. The god of Saturn was known to be the agricultural god, and that time of year, the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, there were a few things that they were celebrating. One of the big ones was the harvest was over, so they were giving thanks to the gods for their crops. And it was also a unique time where roles got reversed. So the peasant people of the times and the slaves actually dined with the nobility of the time. And there was a role reversal where the peasants and the slaves were actually able to like poke jokes at the royalty of the time. And that's where this cake comes in, was there was always someone in the family that was like king for the day. So a lot of times that was chosen in different ways. And one of the ways they believe they chose the king of the day was to bake a cake and to put a fava bean inside. Whoever got the fava bean was king for the day. And from these Roman times and the transition into the Christian orthodoxy, that's where the transition of the festival of Saturnalia became more of the festival of Christmas. Some other similarities from Saturnalia to Christmas are, it was a big time of gift giving, just little trinkets. It could be dice or little figurines, and they believe that's where nowadays there's a lot of countries, including Portugal, where sometimes they'll put a little figurine in this cake. Most historians believe this king's cake came from France to Portugal in the 1800s. The first pastry shop where this cake was being made was called Confeccionaria Nacional, one of the oldest bakeries in Lisbon. In my family, even as a kid, someone would always make a cake, and we would celebrate that day of Epiphany. And it was very unique for me growing up because on January 6th, in the United States, everybody has their Christmas tree gone, their lights down, but we would go door to door to family and friends and basically sing Christmas carols. These Christmas carols were called Janadias, or I believe it's like caroling of the new year. We'd go around from door to door, and it's dark that time of year early, and it was just so strange because we'd be singing at these houses. I remember it being dark, and I remember a lot of other people coming out of their houses like, why are people singing Christmas carols in January? And you'd pull people from the house you visited. So we'd go to one house, pull those people out, then we'd all go to another house. And at the end of it, you probably had 50 people with you, and you all barged into the last house. You didn't know who was showing up. It wasn't like someone put out an itinerary. And at the last house, we had this cake, and we would put a fava bean in it. And I think sometimes they'd put a tromoço in there too. And whoever got the fava bean, they were the last house next year to like host everybody. And whoever got the tromoço had to bake this cake for the following year. Okay, we'll begin the cake. Before I started this intro, I started warming up my milk, and you can see the yeast is very frothy. I'll put in my flour first. So 1,000 grams of flour. I'll put in my salt, 20 grams, which is 2% salt, which is very standard for bread recipes. 1 cup of sugar. And 1 cup of milk, 240 grams. This already has the yeast in there. Give this a stir for a little bit. Now I'll add in my port wine. It's a 1/3 cup of port wine. You could also use like a Madeira wine. If you don't have any of these wines, you could also add something like water, or even maybe like an almond liqueur would probably be delicious in there. I like to separate my egg whites. I use 6 eggs, but I separate them first because fat gets in the way of gluten development. Gluten development, it's 2 different proteins, and when water comes in contact with flour, these 2 proteins start to line up and mesh and get stretchy. That's what gluten does not happen without water, but also fat like butter, egg yolks, they're shortening, so they shorten gluten strands. So I always like to hold off on all the fat and try to get some gluten development before adding the fat. Obviously, you could do this recipe without a machine, but this is one of those recipes that I definitely recommend a machine because getting the butter well incorporated, and there is a decent amount of kneading that has to take place, again, because there's so much fat in this dough, just to develop that gluten, because the fat makes it a little more difficult for gluten development. Okay, you can see with not that much liquid in there, even this mixer has a hard time because that's a pretty firm dough. So I Kneaded it for about 3 minutes. If you're doing it by hand, maybe you would want to do it for about 6 minutes. You do want to do this just a little bit at a time. Almost try to get one egg yolk in, let it incorporate maybe for like 30 seconds to a minute, then your next egg yolk, and the same thing with the butter. Do you see how the eggs haven't incorporated in? It looks really shiny. The dough's kind of slipping in the bowl, you know, just because the fat from the eggs. So really keep on mixing it until the eggs get incorporated into the dough before adding more. And this is a dough where sometimes you'll have to like push it off the hook because it's kind of a sticky, wet dough. Okay, looks like the egg's fully incorporated. I don't see any streaks, so I'll add a little bit more. I think this is my third time taking it off the hook. Add in a little more egg. Okay, the dough's definitely starting to loosen up. Now I will start slowly adding the butter. And it should be maybe about a tablespoon at a time. The butter should be at room temperature. One more piece of butter. Okay, that whole process of adding the egg yolks and the butter probably took about 20 minutes. So just slowly add it in. And now I'll put in the raisins, pine nuts, and pecans. So you can see here, whenever I use nuts, I like to toast the nuts. So for the pine nuts and for the pecans, I just put a little bit of oil in a pan, a little bit of salt, and saute the pine nuts over low heat and the pecans until they get a little dark. I really recommend doing this because the flavor of a roasted nut is so much more intense. There's a lot of variations to this recipe. You could put in other dried fruit. I'm just not a big fan of whatever that green dried fruit they put in some of these cakes is, or like fruit cake. So I try to stick to things I like, raisins, nuts. It's good for me. So if you want to go really traditional, you could also put a dry fava bean in the dough now. Okay, everything's been added, and I will put it in the mold. A lot of times these breads are made where the dough is a little firmer and they shape it like a crown, but I like to make mine a little more buttery, and it tends to do better if you put it in a mold. I like to use these bundt pans because they look sort of like a king's crown. So this bundt pan has been well buttered. I used at least 2 tablespoons of butter. And depending on the size of your bundt pan, I like to fill mine up about maybe like 60 to 70% full because you're going to get some proofing, and then when you bake it, you're going to get some oven spring. So it usually comes over the top a little bit. And then whatever extra you have, you can make some side ones, maybe to try if you do this like a day ahead of time before your company comes over. Well, let this proof. It probably should take about 1.5 hours if your temperature in the house is about 75 degrees. A little longer if it's colder. All right, the bread's been proofing for about 2 hours, and now we'll bake it. So preheat your oven to 375 degrees Fahrenheit, about 190 degrees Celsius, and you're going to bake the cake from approximately 40 to 50 minutes. If you have an instant read digital thermometer, the cake will be done when the interior is at 190 degrees. Okay, you want to let it cool down for at least 15 minutes. And we'll try to flip this over. Beautiful. Looks like a little king's crown, right? This looks about right because that's probably going to compress down a little bit. But if it baked up too high, just trim off. It's going to be the bottom, but trim off the top. That way it'll be more flush if it was too high. And now we'll decorate the cake. You could decorate these cakes in a lot of different ways. So you could use like candied lemon, orange. Sometimes they use candied cherries. Nowadays, I'm not a big fan of all these candied fruits, but it's definitely very traditional to this cake. So I did make some orange peel. I candied some orange peel because I went to 2 different stores. I didn't see any, and I just didn't want to keep on searching. The first thing I'll do for a cake like this is make it a little shiny. I have a peach glaze or peach jam here. A lot of times in cooking school, we'd use apricot jam. Okay, for this glaze, I used about 2 tablespoons of jam and about 1 tablespoon of water. So heat it up so it's not as viscous. And then you just brush it on and it gives it a nice shine. All right, got a little shine to it. I have some candied oranges that I made, and then a few cherries on top. Now we'll finish it up with a few pecans, and you could put a little glaze on the bottom just so they stick better. If you want to try out some other Portuguese festive desserts, try the Bolo de Mel from Madeira Island, and also my recipe for Portuguese sweetbread. Thanks for joining me. Now go cook for someone you love.